Right, ladies and gentlemen, you will probably have seen, or if you haven't seen, you need to see, I did a PB Products video about cold water carping, and in it I briefly mentioned about what we wanted to do at PB Products was to make 4 films that were seasonal orientated. So the first one obviously was cold water carping, which was the winter, and now we're on to spring. And what I would say about springtime fishing is very much like I did with the cold water carping film, which was speak about the varying degrees of winter, where you had the lead up to before a lake was frozen, and then it got a lid on it, and then you had it when it melted and then became fishable again. How the 2 different types of winter fishing had 2 different approaches. Well, it's very much the same in spring, because let's break it down into layman's terms. When we talk about spring, what do we mean? We've got global warming, we've got seasons moving, we've got one season where we think we should have cold conditions, and suddenly we've got these adverse hot conditions, and vice versa. So what is known as spring, when I was a young lad, which was basically March, April and May, and the fish spawned in June, doesn't always work that way now, because sometimes you can get, as we've got at the moment, we're still in March, and yet it appears very nice and very warm today. Last week we had on the syndicate lake that I'm fishing, we had air temperatures of about 20, 21. But here's the key, and I always say this to people: water temperature bears no resemblance to air temperature. And let me put some meat on the bones of that comment. What I mean by that is that, how many times have you turned up at a lake and it can be early morning and you'll see steam rising from the lake, and we all think, oh, this is marvellous and wonderful. What that basically means is that the air temperature of the water is higher, greater than the air temperature, hence why you get steam rising off it. And what that basically means is that water temperature doesn't vary as much as air temperature. However, here's the problem. We can get lulled into a false sense of security in thinking that it's lovely and warm and we'll give the fish a lot of food in there, and yet we still don't take the temperature of the water. Those of you who watch my ramblings over the course of a year and my various live feeds will know that when I talk about certain tactics that I use, I always throw in there the temperature of the water. And one of the things which I've always said to people is that there are bands of which I know the carp will be finicky in their feeding, and basically that's up to 12 to 13 degrees. From about 6 to 12 to 13, the carp are probably working on about 75% of their normal ecosystem. 18 degrees and it's working 100%. But we're not going to get a water temperature until, I would say, at least mid-May of 18 and plus. Maybe sometimes it can be early May, but generally mid-May. So what I'm talking about is where I broke down the winter film, I'm going to break down the spring film for you. And I'm basically going to say March and April is a different approach to May and the early part of June. And what I would try and say to you is be governed by the water temperature. Now, I've had lots of questions. People say to me, well, how do I take the water temperature home? There's 2 ways I would do that. One is by having the temperature taken where you fish, which basically means, say if you're fishing 18 wraps, I know it sounds strange, but you can get various temperatures that have, various thermometers rather, that have a coating on them and they're protected. And so if you're fishing 18 wraps, you can put 18 wraps with your thermometer, cast it out, leave it there for 5 minutes, reel it in, and you'll get your temperature reading. And then what I would do is I would still have another thermometer in the edge, and you can make the correlation. So let's say you're fishing at like 8 foot deep, you cast your thermometer out, you leave it for 5 minutes, reel it in, and it says 12 degrees. You might put your temperature, thermometer rather, in the margins, and it might be 13, 14. Now the 13 and 14 in the margins bears no resemblance to what it's like fishing on your spots. So try and get into a habit of making sure that you take the temperature in your spot. One thing I would do is I would be governed by the daylight hours. So if you think about spring, here we are in March, and now it's getting darker because the clocks have gone forward. It's getting dark at 8 at night and it's getting light about 6. So there's still 10 hours of darkness. That's important, because what you'll find with the darkness is that because of the clarity of the water, I often think I've more chance of catching a big fish this time of year because they can't see the end tackle. And as much as people can emphasise touch and feel, let's not beat about the bush, in the night, in darkness hours, they can't see the same as in daylight hours. So when I get into May and towards June, then I've only got about 6 hours of darkness. So there, it becomes more important to think about rigs and all the things that are involved in getting the fish hooked when they're feeding ferociously. March and April, you're not going to get them feeding, and you're not going to get them feeding ferociously on the bottom. You can get them off the bottom, so zigs come into their own, but I'm not a big zig angler. So what I would do is, I've spoke at length about bait in springtime, the old pre-spawning and the saline requirement. I want to move away from that, and I want to talk about the, take that as read. There's lots of YouTube videos out there about the baits and the salt I use and the cured baits and all the rest of it. But I want to talk a little bit about the rigs that I use. The rigs that I use in the cold water conditions, which are 8 to 12, as I've said, are predominantly short trace, heavy lead, tight lines, tips in the air. And the reason for that is to simply try and get to a situation where I know that when that fish sucks it in, I'm going to get the fish hooked on that ejection. Now that is completely different to a fish picking up a bait and moving off. When you get that situation, there you've got a lot better chance of hooking them. I make the analogy lots of times. If a fish is spot feeding, and that's primarily what early spring fishing is, you're still spot feeding. And when you're spot feeding, you've got the carp from here, bends down, picks up your bait, and the rig has to work to there. So it bends down, sucks in, rights itself. None of this moving off, which it does when the water temperature is up. So you have to work hard at getting your rigs right. And most of the rigs that I think work best in that scenario is what I call the classic upside down hook rig. And the basic upside down hook rig is just what it says. It's the hook underneath the boilie. And so that can incorporate a chod rig, it can incorporate in stiff rig, all those, any sort of system that you've got. I think the German rig and whatever they call it today, all those sort of systems where you're using quite a buoyant pop-up with a heavy weight. And I do like that as opposed to the wafters. And I'll tell you for why. I think that wafters are fine towards the end of my spring campaign because the proliferation of weed means I have to think a lot about not having it too weighted to pull into the weed. But on clearer spots and on areas where there isn't so much proliferation of weed, you can get wafters. And the problem with wafters that I always find, and I always say this to people, is that if it goes in quick, it can come out quick. So this critically balanced, semi-buoyant situation is something that I try and avoid in early spring. And in that situation, I go for, and you've seen it, the weighted hook. And I also incorporate a number 1 or a BB shot in that. And that's basically what I'm looking for, is I'm looking for an anchor point that keeps the boilie down. Now obviously people say to me, do you worry about the buoyancy of your pop-ups as well? Now the buoyancy of the pop-up is vital when you think about rigs, because it determines some of the end tackle that I use. I'll give you an example. If I am using something where I'm looking for a critically balanced situation, I will always try and use a bigger hook, not just for its hooking properties, but from its weight. So when I think about my trace, my hook, even my air and my air stop, I always link them in to a weighted system, because I want to try and get it so that it drops. When the fish closes its mouth, it drops down. And that I think is important when they're trying to right themselves. And one of the things is that, again, I say to people, know the quarry of the fish you're fishing for. If you're on a water where they predominantly have an underslung mouth, which is like that, if you're not careful, you can just catch it. So you have to think clearly about your rigs. Now, one thing that I do use is I try to keep away from certain leaders. I do find that because I'm on big fish syndicates where a lot of leader material gets banned and there's no, not only is there no lead core, there's no lead-free leaders. So more and more I'm turning to, and I know it's a plug, but I'll go do it anyway, I'm turning to the heavy version of the control mainline. I mean, this is 0.43. Would you believe one of the big fish waters I'm fishing in Cambridgeshire at the moment, you must use 0.4 or more. It's as simple as that. So although 0.43 might sound a lot, on some waters that's the minimum requirement that they need if it's very weedy. So when I'm trying to sum up my rig requirements in the spring, I want it to be something that works quickly and is effective. And the one thing that I've found with those situations is jelly wire is a consistent performer to me. I like jelly wire because when you strip it back, you've got an inherent suppleness, but it doesn't detract from still the stiffness there. So you can create an hinge rig situation quite quickly. Also, one thing which I would do, and I mentioned it on other videos that we've done on the PB YouTube channels, is to use large rig rings so that you've got the freedom of movement there. That I think is an important point with the rig as well. I also like to use, particularly when the fish are feeding, if you imagine, if you get 4 or 5 fish in a very short area and your line is coming down at an angle, you can get line bites. By the simple use, and we cut away to it a long time ago, by the simple use of long attachments of our tungsten tubing, I can lay that down. And if you think about it, if my left hand is where the bait is and my right hand is where the line comes to, you can see that I've got 3 foot that's on the deck, and that 3 foot clearance will stop a lot of false bites when I have 3 or 4 big ones in a small spot. So to go over and summarise, what I would say to you is don't get fazed by thinking that although we've got extra daylight and we've got extra sunlight, that somehow the fish will suddenly start feeding ravenously. This is all based upon water temperature. Take the water temperature and tailor your approach accordingly. I don't fish particles very much and I don't fish pellets very much, so most of my bait approach is also around the boilie system. I've spoke for eon about how to tinker with your baits to make them more attractive, but on the rig front, keep it simple, and the most important rig that you can have is one that is capable of landing your fish. So go big, go strong, go thick, and land what you get. And let's hope that when we talk again about summer tactics, you'll see that spring can be divided quite clearly into early spring and late spring. Good luck.